Welcome to our symposium, Torture, Security, and the Law. I'm Bill Roller, president of the Berkeley Group Education Foundation, a partner in the creation of this program. My participation today will be dedicated to the memory of my father-in-law, Isidore Edelstein, who graduated New York University Law School 88 years ago in 1928. I want to thank Jeremy Waldron, university professor at NYU Law, for inviting us to New York and making this event possible. Other thanks goes to Lavinia Barbu and her assistants, and also thanks to Gabe Rosenstein, who was helpful for audio-visual aids. Today's proceedings will be videotaped and placed on YouTube under U.S. Law and Torture for distribution to the general public. A copy will also go to the Special Rapporteur for Torture, Juan Mendez, at the United Nations. I'd also like to invite people that during our session, if you wish to go outside and have refreshments during the proceedings, do so. The order of the day will be as follows. I shall introduce each of our panelists in the order presented in our brochure. Each speaker will have approximately 20 minutes to make their opening statement. I'll keep track of time and notify speakers when we must move on. After each panelist has spoken, I'll make a few remarks on the psychological consequences for a society that refuses to hold its leaders accountable for torture. Then I'll facilitate a discussion among our panelists, and last, we'll open discussion for our audience and to include questions and comments from all of you. Our first speaker will be Jeremy Waldron, university professor at NYU School of Law. He is the author of recent books, The Harm of Hate Speech, Political Theory, and Torture, Terror, and Trade-Offs, Philosophy for the White House. Please welcome Jeremy Waldron. Thank you.
I'm going to speak from the pulpit. I don't remember when I was first called a torture bore, but I thought I'd reflect on what it is to be a torture bore and why torture bores may be important. Torture bores are those who seem to be obsessed with the issue of torture. Maybe we're all on the panel torture bores. That is, we don't want to let go of the concerns that surfaced about the interrogation program in the years 2002 through to 2007. We don't want to let go of the issue. We resist replacing it with other questions, even other human rights questions. For us, it sometimes appears to be the only issue on the agenda, or we act as though it were, and sometimes perhaps we let it swamp other equally important issues in and around the security agenda, like detention policy, like surveillance, like targeted killing, and so on. We harp on about the torture issue, even after the White House has abandoned its support for the relevant practices after 2008, but we harp on nevertheless. And we do so in the face of an audience that finds the topic distasteful, wishes that the memory of the dark years of 2002 to 2007 would just go away, an audience who thinks that since that time, things have moved on. I want to give us some reason for thinking that we need to keep very mindful on this issue of torture and keep it on the agenda of our thinking about human dignity, our thinking about national security, and our thinking about human and constitutional rights. But I want to just talk a little bit also about, I don't think it's a danger, but just some characteristics of keeping this issue at the forefront of our attention, ideally with something like torture, condemned as it is more or less unconditionally by law, by human rights instruments, by morality around the world. Ideally, at the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st century, torture would simply be of historical interest. It would be off the agenda as a live option. It would be out of the question to use as an instrument of national policy. But something being out of the question is an interesting phenomenon. There was a philosopher called Bernard Williams, a very eminent man who died 2003, sounds about right. And he would say, when he wanted to suggest that some distasteful action should be out of the question, like having somebody killed, he said, "I mean by that there's no question of it, and it would be thought outrageous or insane to even mention it as an option. The situation is not one of those in which such options are mentioned and then, after some thought, all things considered, laid aside." I believe Williams glossed this one by insisting that what we don't want are politicians facing difficulty with some opponent to go around saying, "Of course we could have him killed, but that's out of the question." That's sort of one thought too many. But we seem to be in a situation where, of those two possibilities, something being simply out of the question and something being all things considered out of the question, that torture is going to be and remain in the second category. That was the can of worms we opened up in 2002, and it's very hard to close it again. Torture simmers as an option, never entirely goes away as a possibility, and I think that's a matter of grave concern. So, for example, during the primary campaigns last year and this year for the GOP candidates, we had people like Jeb Bush saying he wouldn't rule out waterboarding in interrogations. We had Ted Cruz claiming at one point that waterboarding was not torture. We had Carly Fiorina offering a vigorous defense of CIA waterboarding as a tactic that helped keep our nation safe in the aftermath of 9/11. We had Ben Carson saying he wouldn't take anything off the agenda. And most recently, as you know, we've had Donald Trump, the presidential candidate for the Republican Party, asking his audience, "What do you think about waterboarding?" And he said, "I like it a lot. I don't think it's tough enough." He said, if they could expand the laws, I would do a lot more than waterboarding. And he said that that tactic was peanuts compared to many alternatives. So we have this as a sort of an enduring possibility. It hasn't been, as it were, taken out of the question in this particular sense that I mentioned. And it's a worry also because although there was a lot of immediate response, negative response to Donald Trump's suggestion that waterboarding was something that he liked and didn't think it was tough enough, much of the response was like that of Senator McCain, who said, well, it never produces reliable information, which sounds like a hard-headed pragmatist rather than a principled condemnation of torture. And one of the things about being a torture bore is that you want to go around saying, even if it did produce reliable information, or even if torturing 100 people led people to blurt out various things, even things that they think that their torturers want, their tormentors want to hear, those are nevertheless pieces of information that can be built up into a mosaic which might provide some insight. Even if it does produce reliable information in that sort of way, in the sort of way that the British began to build up their knowledge of the Irish Republican Army after the torture of the 1970s. And I believe the Bush administration began to build up their knowledge of the structure of Al-Qaeda after 2002. Even if it does generate good information, it needs to be out of the question in that sense. And that means that we have to have an absolute rather than a conditional condemnation of it. Those who talk about torture do it not because they are sadists, but because they believe the nation faces grave dangers and still faces grave dangers. And possibly it's a little bit hard for us in where we are now to capture the sense of the grave dangers that might threaten us in the wake of September the 11th, 2001. People were worried about nuclear weapon attacks or biosecurity attacks or repetitions of the kind of mass murder and atrocities that we saw in 2001. And those prospects haven't entirely disappeared, although they now have a different texture and a different flavor from those that we faced in 2001. But if this happens again, and if these possibilities of Donald Trump and others begin to be taken with some practical seriousness, then the torture bores among us will not be delighted that this has come into our own. There'll be a terrible sense of having to go through a whole tedious business all over again. Once again, we have to start examining legal memos. Once again, we have to start arguing the case for the main legal sources of the illegality of torture. Once again, we have to begin mobilizing opinion against it, which was by no means easy. Opinion leaders, whether they were journalists, politicians, lawyers, philosophers, clergymen and clergywomen, were the hardest people to mobilize in 2002 to 2007. There was no real effective opposition from the churches until a gathering that Mark and I attended in at the beginning of 2006 at Princeton. Philosophers were happy to say that as a pragmatic matter it would probably be ill-advisable, but they would usually preface that by saying, of course you can't rule torture out, because they could always imagine a ticking bomb situation. And that was the first thing they always wanted their audience to hear, the ticking bomb hypothetical that would make sense, the possibility of torture. And what it revealed about moral philosophy, it has a great deal of difficulty with the idea of moral absolutes. So we would have to go back into that swamp, into that morass, and it's a frightening thing. Not just that, but the problem of torture, the problem that revealed itself to us in 2002 to 2008, wasn't just a matter of a few guys with some hapless detainee on a waterboard, which that situation is bad enough, but we were talking about a situation that opened up, and I'm going to mix metaphors mercilessly now, it opened up an abyss of many dimensions. It opened up an abyss of many dimensions. There was the horror of physical abuse and mental abuse of detainees itself. There was the impact that had on any subsequent legal proceedings, or the possibility of any subsequent legal proceedings of those who might have been responsible for acts of terror. There was, and I emphasized this in some of the work that I published in 2006, I think, the impact of removing the unthinkability of torture as a kind of archetype in the law, which we use as a point of reference, as a landmark in all sorts of other areas of constitutional rights. We say, well, this is coming uncomfortably close to torture, but if somebody says, well, hang on, torture is not necessarily illegal, so why coming uncomfortably close to torture is a problem with some policy. The removal of a landmark from the law here, the problematizing of the United States relations with whole bodies of not only national and constitutional law, but international law, international humanitarian law, international human rights law, coupled with a concerted effort on the parts of legal advisors to the administration to blur and distort and sideline whatever sharp edges were associated with the condemnation of torture. There was that dimension of the abyss. There was the abyss of our machinations with repressive regimes through the rendition program. There was the poisoning of our international reputation and our reputational ability to uphold human rights standards. There was, I believe, the poisoning of relations between various agencies within the country, between the FBI and the CIA, for example, and between the military and the CIA. There was the compromising of various professions, and I know that Bill will talk about this, professions that were involved, not only the legal profession to its disgrace, but the profession of psychologists. There was the lurid descent into depravity revealed particularly at Abu Ghraib, which showed that torture as a phenomenon is, as I said, not just a matter of a few guys with some guy on a waterboard doing what needs to be done, but that it opens up a portal into some of the more demonic aspects of human behavior, a portal that it's very hard to close. So you remember the sexual abuse, the screeching, the foul attacks on individual honor, the use of animals, and so on during that lurid episode. There is the possibility of the accumulation of repressive authority. If torture is okay, then why isn't killing okay? If torture is okay, then why isn't indefinite detention without trial okay? Just the gradual sense that since the boundaries are being blurred, the accumulation of repressive authority, which often depends on sharp boundaries defined by the rule of law, becomes much harder to prevent. And there is the possible resurgence of brutality and torture in other contexts. We talk about it in the national security context. We don't realize how much work had to be done, to largely eliminate brutal practices of interrogation from our police forces. Yeah? Long time ago, you're taken into custody, poor person, African American, you would probably be greeted with the third degree. Yeah? Mostly doesn't happen. I'm not saying the police forces are perfect, but it mostly doesn't happen, and it didn't cease to happen by magic. It happened by virtue of developing new practices of mutual reporting, new practices of interrogation, new sorts of buddy systems within the police forces. This didn't go away by magic. It won't stay away by magic, and the non-magical route for it to come back in is not entirely out of the question. I wanted to mention those 9 or 10 different dimensions of the problem to indicate that when we do harp on about torture, we're not just harping on about a few guys with a waterboard, but we are harping on about a nightmarish practice that opens up this multi-dimensional gaping hole in our public morality. One of the things that happened during those years, particularly through the efforts of those who authored legal memos attempting to establish that this was a respectable legal practice, was that we came close, I don't think we got there, we came close to the routinization and institutionalization of abusive interrogation. And we need to pause about that. Alan Dershowitz used to talk, he claims only hypothetically, I claim it wasn't as hypothetical as all that, about the possibility of establishing a system of torture warrants. And he regaled his students at Harvard Law School with possibilities along these lines. But certainly there were processes established, pathways of authorization established. Mark Danner has written very extensively about this in the Torture and Truth book. And the pathways of authorization that were established, the abuse of interrogation was institutionalized in certain ways. And we know what it is for, I'm going to say morally dodgy, that makes it sound like something trivial, morally difficult practices to become institutionalized, because we have watched that happen with assassination as a tactic in the last 6 or 8 years, whereby targeted killing, on a scale of thousands of killings, has become institutionalized. There aren't targeted killing warrants being issued by the courts, but President Obama in his administration has established pathways of authorization whereby committees meet, I think, on Tuesdays and determine which names from a list will be taken up for possible action of this sort. So the possibility that that kind of institutionalization would attend torture 2.0, torture the second time round, torture as a practice in this decade as opposed to last decade, remains a frightening prospect, because what it would institutionalize is, again, as I said, not just the 3 or 4 guys with a waterboard, but institutionalize the whole package of attitudes towards public opinion, towards the professions, and towards law that torture involves. Talking like this means that I ought to say something about thank you, Bill, something about the possible responses, apart from just harping on the practice, that can prevent this from taking place. I think harping on the practice is one of the most valuable things that anybody can do, just to keep the topic alive. There's no way it's going to go back into the realm of the unthinkable. It's going to remain this simmering prospect. But we can organize things differently. The Articles 10 and 11 of the Convention on Torture, to which this nation is a signatory, require that in the trainings and procedures of police forces and security forces and the military, that those procedures and trainings be organized with a view to the eradication of torture, that procedures be set up that are followed when people are taken into custody or held in custody, whether the custody is formal or informal, that there be systems of reporting and systems of scrutiny and systems of supervision that make that possible. And I think insisting on that, not just the glamorous parts of the Convention on Torture that talk about the authorization of prosecutions, but just also the parts that are particularly focused on what can be done organizationally and institutionally to prevent it. That, as I said, was what happened in the police forces. Yeah? It wasn't just that there were a few officers who were prosecuted. And the last thing I want to say really is about the issue of prosecutions. My friends on the panel, some of them will talk about the dangers of not having held people accountable in the years after 2007, 2008, once the practice came to an end. I do believe, and I said this in the introduction in Torture, Terror, and Trade-offs, that I think that was a very difficult question and a matter of judgment in a new presidency and a new administration that was, as we have seen over the subsequent years, facing terrible issues of legitimation. That it is possible that, as well as sending a message about the unacceptability of torture, holding people criminally accountable for what were, by any account, very serious offenses. Our anti-torture statute punishes torture with anything up to life imprisonment, and if death results, as it did result in some cases, punishes torture with death. It's a capital offense. Very serious offending. Nevertheless, it would have torn the country apart, I believe, and made the prospects for this is just a matter of judgment and speculation, of course. So I think when we think about ways of eliminating this from the arsenal of our security methods, we ought to think not just about the possibility of holding people accountable, but about this issue of routinization, not just routinizing abusive interrogation, but routinizing the procedures that make it harder to engage in abusive interrogation. Bill, I'm going to stop there. I think I'm finished, but thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jeremy, for your incisive and thoughtful comments. Our next speaker will be Mark Danner, who is the public intellectual most responsible, in my opinion, for keeping the issue of torture in the public eye. He's a prolific writer for the New York Review of Books, as well as other journals. Most recently, he's published the books Spiral, Trapped in the Forever War, Stripping Bare the Body, and Torture and Truth. He's Chancellor's Professor of Journalism and English at UC Berkeley, and James Clark Chase Professor of Foreign Affairs and Humanities at Bard College. Please welcome Mark Danner.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bill. And thank you, Jeremy, for organizing this today. Thanks to Lavinia and the others Bob Cole and others who've worked to make this event possible. Jeremy covered an astonishing amount of material in 20 minutes. Less than 20 minutes. And I don't know where to start except to say that I am going to plead also to being a torture bore. And I think probably many people in this room are torture bores as well. And I want immediately to respond to that epithet of torture bore by paraphrasing, I think it was Trotsky who said, paraphrasing him, you may not be interested in torture, but torture is interested in you. And this happens to be a fact. You can ignore it, but if you turn on your television tonight and God forbid there's a young man kneeling in the dust in an orange prison suit with somebody masked behind him about to cut his head off, which is an image that we've grown used to from the Islamic State in the last couple of years, that image, that orange jumpsuit, is about torture. It's about Guantanamo, which in the Middle East means torture. And I'm always astonished when I talk to Americans that many of them don't realize that. Don't realize that, in fact, this has to do very directly with the torture that's been perpetrated over the last, beginning in late 2001, early 2002, on Muslim prisoners. Jeremy mentioned the political campaign. I think my second argument for torture being interested in you would be to quote some words from the campaign. He gave us a partial quote. I'm going to go a little farther. It's, of course, from Donald Trump, who is now our tribune of public attitudes. By that I mean he tells us how far you can go and a little bit farther. And he said about a year ago, they chop off our young people's heads and put them on a stick. They build these iron cages and they'll put 20 people in them and they drop them in the ocean for 15 minutes and pull them up 15 minutes later. Would I approve waterboarding? You bet your ass I would. And I would approve more than that. Don't kid yourself, folks. It works, okay? It works. Only a stupid person would say it doesn't work. And then he repeats, it works. Only a stupid person would say it doesn't work. Believe me, it works. And you know what? If it doesn't work, they deserve it anyway for what they're doing. They deserve it anyway. I'm very fond of this quotation because it seems to me it tells us a couple things. The first is it tells us that torture, as Jeremy so eloquently said, is an immediate issue. It's an immediate issue. We're not talking about something that happened between the years 2001 and 2006. We're talking about something that used to be an anathema and has now become a policy choice. That, during the lifetimes of everyone in this room, is an extremely significant change. And it has happened already. Torture is now a policy choice. Mitt Romney, when he ran in 2012, let it be known in the fall during that campaign in late October by leaking a memo to the New York Times that if elected, he would reinstitute what he called enhanced interrogation techniques. That was Mitt Romney, the gentleman businessman, not Donald Trump, the outrageous public provocateur. I think it is a fair bet, and Jeremy indicated this by his citation of the various positions of the Republican candidates this year, during this year's campaign. I believe that it's a fair bet that just about any one of them, if elected, would reinstitute some program of enhanced interrogation. Well, you say, it's illegal. It's illegal. Here we are in NYU Law School, and I probably am the only person in this room who is not only not a lawyer, but is not going to become a lawyer. Here's two. So let me talk about the law for a minute. Indeed, it is illegal. It was illegal in 2001. Jeremy again referred to this. There's the Convention Against Torture, to which the United States is a signatory, in which torture is designated any act by which severe pain or suffering, whether physical or mental, is intentionally inflicted on a person for such purposes as obtaining from him or a third person information or a confession, punishing him for an act he or a third person has committed or is expected of having committed, or intimidating or coercing him or a third person, ... Anybody who has read the accounts of waterboarding, and we have very intimate accounts of waterboarding, we have intimate accounts of walling, we have intimate accounts of immersion in ice-cold water, intimate accounts of sleep deprivation, very detailed. I've published them in several books. We've had them actually since 2004. Anybody who has read those and compares them to that definition, I think, can have no doubt that some of those acts fit under that definition. Or would you rather go to the U.S. Code, Title 18? Torture means an act committed by a person acting under the color of law, specifically intended to inflict severe physical or mental pain or suffering upon another person within his custody or physical control. And we have, of course, also Section 2340A, whoever outside the United States commits or attempts to commit torture shall be fined under this title or imprisoned not more than 20 years or both. And if death results, as Jeremy said, to any person from conduct prohibited by this subsection shall be punished by death or imprisoned for any term of years or for life. Torture, illegal. But indeed, the government, under color of law, committed it. If I had more time, I'd read you an account of waterboarding. It's extremely brutal. It left the first man subjected to it, Abu Zubaydah, completely unresponsive. I'm quoting here from the Senate Executive Summary of the Senate Intelligence Committee report. Completely unresponsive, his mouth full with bubbles rising through his full mouth. That is, his mouth, open mouth, was full of water. Bubbles coming up through, completely unresponsive. That was during his 82nd or 83rd waterboarding. So waterboarding's illegal, but we did it. Well, what should we do about that? You're all lawyers. What should we do about that? It's illegal, and yet we did it anyway. Not only did we do it anyway, but our highest political leaders, including the senior official in the US government, the President of the United States, approved it. And indeed talked about it publicly in 2006, among other times. What should we do about it? Well, according to Dianne Feinstein and John McCain, the senator from Arizona, Republican, being the only member of the Senate who has himself endured torture at the hands of the North Vietnamese, passed an amendment. Amendment 1889. This was passed more than a year ago. Has anybody heard of it? No? Nobody's heard of it. Well, this amendment, very important. You know what the amendment did? It reaffirmed the illegality of torture. It reaffirmed it. Now again, I'd like to make a challenge to you as lawyers or incipient lawyers. What do you do when a law has been violated, publicly exposed to have been violated? Those who have violated it have claimed responsibility for it. And I have in mind here George W. Bush, who admits to ordering the torture of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed in his memoirs, and Dick Cheney, who on numerous public occasions, the former vice president, has indeed admitted that he ordered this behavior. What do? Well, you try to make it more illegal, I guess. So that in 2015, and this amendment was passed, putting into law, to be fair to it, the executive order that President Obama, on his second full day in office, instituted which prohibited torture. Now, when you hear prohibited torture, it seems to me you should automatically, your legal inner ear should say, wait a minute, the president prohibited torture? There's a problem with that. It's up to Congress to prohibit torture. Can the president prohibit murder? No, he can't. But indeed, he went a couple of months later to his Nobel Prize to accept his Nobel Peace Prize, and he said, that's why I prohibited torture. Big applause line among his European audience. But in fact, the notion that the president prohibits torture follows directly along the reasoning that the president has it within his power to permit torture. So a presidential prohibition is not good news, it's bad news, right? So he prohibited it, and then last year, John McCain, Dianne Feinstein, Republican and Democrat, submit to the Senate an amendment, 1889, which is approved by 72 senators, and indeed has become the law of the land. Now, my subject today is torture and accountability, and I would like to ask you whether indeed torture is now illegal, whether that quote I read from Donald Trump we should simply dismiss, because, what the hell is this guy saying? He says a lot of stupid things. He's just being a provocateur. He obviously can't torture. It's illegal. It's illegal by the Convention Against Torture. It's illegal by statute, which I read to you. Oh, sorry. Those made it illegal, but we still did it. But now it's illegal again. And I would submit to you, if you are in the position, if the Senate and the Congress of the United States is in the position of making something illegal again, there is a problem. Now, what about accountability? I find myself agreeing completely with Jeremy's point that prosecutions were not going to be possible in 2009. They're probably not possible now. But the entire issue of prosecutions brings up, to me, a number of very interesting issues. Can you prosecute those who tortured without prosecuting those who ordered them to torture? Is that justice? Is that justice? If it is possible to prosecute those who tortured, but politically impossible to prosecute those who ordered them to torture, you see how the slippage happens. Do we have a situation more unjust than the one we started with? And if this is the case, how do we extricate ourselves? Once you make torture legal, de facto, how do you render it illegal again? And I would second what Jeremy said so eloquently about the general corruption that this decision has brought to us. And when I say general corruption, I'm talking first about the law and the power of the law to govern our behavior, because we are in a situation when it comes to the law that is, well, it certainly isn't unprecedented, but it's hard to think of clear precedents. If Germany perhaps had somehow negotiated an end to the Second World War, which wouldn't involve an occupation, and left the Nuremberg laws in place, may seem like a very florid comparison, but I'm trying to think of something that does this justice. I don't know what other comparison I could come up with. So if there is no possibility at the present time of prosecuting, what exactly is it that would keep Donald Trump from following through on what was a public promise? And I think here we get into larger issues of public corruption that Jeremy referred to, which is to say, why did Donald J. Trump say that in Cleveland and repeat it again and again? Because there's a constituency for it. There's a constituency for it. And this is where it seems to me we get away from issues. Liberals very often talk about torture and they talk about the fact that it doesn't work. It doesn't work. They're on practical ground. They're on utilitarian ground, consequentialism. Right? It doesn't work. That's the argument of the ticking bomb stood on its head. We only use it for a situation of the ticking bomb, right? David Lubin has a very brilliant law review article talking about the ticking bomb. But the second reason I love Donald Trump's quote, to get back to that second reason, is he is stripping away the notion here of the ticking bomb and the notion of the practicality of torture. It works. Only a stupid person would say it doesn't work. And you know what? If it doesn't work, they deserve it anyway for what they're doing. They deserve it anyway. Torture is not simply an hygienic, scientific way to, when pressed to the limit, a self-fearing democracy tries to get information out of detainees. Torture is also a highly symbolic activity, and we see it in our public realm, a measure of commitment. I, your leader, am willing to do absolutely anything to protect you. I don't care about them. I'm going to hurt them. I care about you. I think that, politically speaking, is what torture says. And I think Donald J. Trump has rendered a service for all of us by showing us this side of torture and by revealing it for what it is now, which is not simply a legal problem, but a political problem. A problem about our general politics of fear, our outsized fear of terrorism, and various disreputable and sordid political motives that we don't often like to look at. For example, the need for vengeance, the desire for vengeance. And that is why this has become, it seems to me, not only a popular political issue on the Republican side, but one that has been installed inextricably in our public life. And the answer to that, how we fix that, I don't know. I simply don't know. Diplomats have an expression, you can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. Goes with other diplomatic expressions like walking back the cat. You can't put the toothpaste back in the tube. And however trivial that expression sounds, I keep thinking of that because it seems to me that there's something that's come out of our body politic, that law, and Jeremy has written on this very eloquently, that law is a system of beliefs that affect one another, a system of precepts that we corrupt at our peril. And it seems to me this has become now, torture has become an abiding reality of our public life. The most that we can hope for is a rejection of the candidate who advocates so publicly the use of torture, and not only torture, but torture as revenge, and a gradual movement by the candidate elected in his place to strengthen the strictures against torture. And hear what Jeremy said about training and so on, which are indeed are mentioned in the Convention Against Torture, becomes extremely important. One would like to reach the point where at the political level, if indeed this is ordered again, at the working level it would be refused. We were talking at lunch, and I could think of only one major policy figure in the Bush administration who stood up and refused to go along with torture, and that's Alberto Mora, at the time the JAG, Judge Advocate General, head of the JAG Corps in the Navy. One would like to reach the point where it would be simply inconceivable that such orders would be followed within the officer corps and within the intelligence services. But that also has its costs. And we'll talk about those more during the discussion. And I'm sorry for the unremittingly bleak tone of my remarks. I said when I arrived that the color of the sky reflects the color of our subject matter today. And I'm grateful to all of you for coming and for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, for your cogent statements and the questions you raise. I hope we'll have time to explore in our discussion among panel members about these cogent ideas. Our next speaker is Dror Ladin, staff attorney for the American Civil Liberties Union National Security Project. He has litigated many cases involving national security, detention, and torture. An ongoing lawsuit seeks to hold accountable James Mitchell and John Jessen, the psychologists who designed and helped implement the systematic abuse of CIA prisoners. Please welcome Dror Ladin.
I'm seldom accused of being an optimist, but after that relentlessly bleak presentation, I'm going to offer just I disagree with none of the facts, but I'm going to offer just a slightly different narrative arc. And I think a really key part of my understanding of torture comes from the way it interacts with secrecy. The reason being, so much of the development of the torture program not only occurred in secret, but was only made possible because of secrecy. And I think that should tell us something, which is all the people who squeezed the toothpaste out of the tube, who let the genie out of the bottle, they all had this intuition that what they were doing would not withstand the light of day, and that under the scrutiny of Americans, of the world, their methods would simply fall apart as not being lawful, certainly, but also not being part of our moral intuition as to how we are as a people, how we operate, even when faced with national security threats. Of course, their answer to that was to operate in secret. And secrecy has been particularly dangerous when it comes to torture. We talked a little bit about the corruption of institutions, and one of the incredible things about torture was how many institutions it corrupted, both in secret and because of the secrecy. So what's fairly well known among some circles, and what I think Bob will be discussing, is the way in which government lawyers became a party to this through secret memos that were deployed preposterous reasoning that would, again, never withstand scrutiny, but were written with an eye to never be scrutinized. There were other institutions that functioned very similarly. So, for example, last year we had a report about the American Psychological Association in which psychologists were effectively misled by their own leadership, which told them that their ethical code prohibited participation in abusive interrogations, while at the same time secretly colluding with the Department of Defense to write an ethics code that would allow psychologists to participate in abuses at Guantanamo. There was an entire secret group within the American Psychological Association that made this possible. And it was only once that was revealed that psychologists everywhere who were members of the American Psychological Association realized how far their professional leadership had fallen and promptly acted to remedy it, to the point where now military psychologists are saying we're hamstrung and are seeking to roll back the changes that were introduced just last year. Secrecy is dangerous because it shields perpetrators, it distorts the public debate, and as a consequence of both of those, it undermines our democracy. It also compounds the harm of the victims of torture. So while at the same time, people who are responsible for torture, whether within the APA, whether within the Department of Justice, whether within the CIA, slowly climb the ladders of their professions without what they were doing being exposed, victims were actually prevented, both physically and legally, from speaking about what had happened to them. One of the remarkable progressions of the torture story is when the CIA's secret prisoners were moved to Guantanamo, there was a censorship regime installed in their military commission's trials, which whenever anyone would begin to speak about what had happened to him, the audio would be cut so that no one would be able to hear, no one would be able to know. And again, I emphasize this because the fact of it is, when you hear someone describe being tortured, it's not as easy as, standing in front of a group of cheering people in New Hampshire or Cleveland or wherever else and saying, we're going to get the bad guys. When you talk to victims of torture, you see that some of them, may be guilty of any number of things, others were not, but all of them are human beings who looked another human in the eye as that human degraded them, abused them, and tortured them. So I represent a number of people like that. Two of my clients are named Suleiman Abdullah Salim and Mohammed Bensoud, and they were both tortured in secret CIA prisons. And to them, not only was the torture itself something that still affects them every single day of their lives, but the fact that no one believed them was critical. No one thought, that the United States did this sort of thing, that it just wasn't within the realm of the thinkable at the time. And so they went back very, very hurt, very damaged, and had nothing. They had no apology from the United States, they had no acknowledgement, and their own family members didn't believe them. They just disappeared and then shown up with these stories that no one could believe. There's a transcript that I had released earlier this year as part of a Freedom of Information Act request, in which at the military commissions, a victim of torture, the notation in the transcript is, holds up his wrists and says, I've been tortured by the CIA, nobody will believe me. The last time I had that transcript released, that passage was blacked out. So even the no one will believe me was censored. Even worse is a third one of my clients whose name is Gul Rahman. He's the only detainee mentioned in the Senate torture report who actually died under torture. And his family was never informed. As far as they knew, he just disappeared. Years after his death, they were still writing to the International Committee of the Red Cross saying, does anyone know where he is? He was kidnapped and we've never seen him again. And the amazing thing is the government still has never said anything to his family, never returned the body. This is something that continues to affect his family, but it's also a stain on our reputation. The government secrecy didn't just compound the trauma that the CIA inflicted on torture victims, but it also allowed the agency to manipulate lawmakers and the public. So even as government lawyers were in court every time some victim actually managed to get a lawsuit together, which only happened a handful of times, every time that happened, government lawyers would come into court and say, the entire torture program is too secret for courts to handle. And so these cases must be dismissed. There's no safe way we can litigate these claims. At the same time as secrecy was being used as a weapon to keep victims out of court, the CIA itself was selling the use of torture to Americans. It was consulting with the people who made Zero Dark 30, telling them a story about how CIA had led to Osama bin Laden's death. It was, leaking names of plots that may or may not have been entirely fabricated under torture. So secrecy allowed a corruption of even our popular democracy by very selectively choosing certain narratives that could be told, which were those that the agency or the government wanted out there, while shutting down any other efforts to tell the other side of the story. This was devastatingly effective for many, many years. And it's less effective now. And I think that that's a really key point of light in this otherwise bleak story, which is we do have a trajectory of secrecy and accountability right now, and it can go one of two ways. We can continue on the road of transparency and reckoning and accountability, and I'll talk a little bit about what we think that should look like, but obviously there's other opinions. Or it can turn out that once exposed to the light of day, we actually don't care. Torture actually didn't need to be secret in the first place. If that's the answer, if that's what turns out to be the case, then a lot of lawyers and a lot of CIA people wasted a lot of time trying to keep this program secret. My hope is that that's not, in fact, the way the American public reacts and the way this story develops. So just to give you a sense of how long the sweep has been, the ACLU filed its first Freedom of Information lawsuit about torture in 2003. At that time, documents started to trickle out, almost completely redacted. All forms of torture were referred to as intelligence sources and methods and kept entirely secret. But slowly information accumulated, just a little bit. In 2005, the ACLU brought the first lawsuit concerning the CIA torture program in a case called El Masri v. Tenet. That case was dismissed immediately before any discovery or any adjudication of the merits on the basis of state secrets. The government said the case was simply too secret to litigate. Also in 2005, the CIA destroyed the torture videotapes it had produced. And I think that those torture videotapes are also a really important part of this tension between secrecy and accountability, because the fact that the tapes were destroyed, the CIA official line on it is they were destroyed because they showed the faces of interrogators. And of course, as soon as the faces of these people would become public, the Al-Qaeda death squads that lurk behind every tree and corner will track these CIA agents down. That's obviously absurd to everyone but the CIA. And many people who are associated with the torture program have had their identities disclosed, and several of them are very proud of it. I've never heard of a credible threat to any of them. But in any event, the tapes did not have faces blacked out or anything like that, which would be one way of trying to deal with that problem. Instead, Jose Rodriguez, who went on to become the director of the National Clandestine Service, just ordered the tapes destroyed, which I think a fair-minded observer would wonder, were they destroyed because even Americans who cheer waterboarding in principle might object to seeing it in practice. Even Americans who find in the abstract the concept of abusing another person or harshly interrogating them to try to get some national security benefit, they might still find it horrifying when confronted with the actual practice. In any event, the CIA destroyed the torture videotapes. This led to a number of things: multiple Department of Justice investigations, contempt proceedings, and a FOIA lawsuit. But perhaps most importantly, what it led was the Senate Subcommittee on Intelligence to begin inquiring as to what was going on. How was the CIA destroying tapes it wasn't supposed to be keeping from its overseers? The Senate initiated an investigation. At the same time, the ACLU brought its second lawsuit with regard to the torture program, suing Jeppesen Data Plan, which was a Boeing subsidiary that ran torture flights. They would move prisoners from one secret prison to another to facilitate their torture. That lawsuit was also dismissed on state secrets. In 2009, the Senate received the results of its initial inquiry into the destruction of the tapes and realized just how horrific the CIA's program was. It opened a full investigation. That investigation lasted for 3 more years. We're now in 2012. And in December of that year, the Senate finalized its report. It took 2 additional years for that report to be cleared by the CIA and the White House. The CIA resisted its disclosure at every stage and warned of horrific consequences if that report were ever to be released. In December of 2014, that report was released. Consequences failed to materialize, but in 2015, we brought a lawsuit on behalf of the 3 men who I described earlier against the 2 psychologists who profited enormously from designing and implementing torture. And for the first time ever, the government did not move to dismiss that lawsuit on the basis of secrecy. A claim of secrecy just became completely untenable. And so we've never had a day in court for torture victims to evaluate the legality of what was done to them, to force the people who did it to them to account for it. But now we are. And just yesterday, we had a hearing on discovery in the case in which a Department of Justice lawyer said something to the effect of, the word unprecedented gets tossed around a lot, but we're about to have the director of the National Clandestine Service sit down and answer questions under oath to civilian attorneys. So Jose Rodriguez and John Rizzo are both going to be deposed in this lawsuit, which is stunning, which is a complete turnaround, and which I'm hopeful is part of an arc that doesn't end in torture being normalized, but in fact cabins it to this period in which we thought we could do it all in secret. And when we're beyond secrecy, we realize we can't. Where are we now? To the extent we were ever able to plead ignorance, we can't anymore. There's so much public about the torture program that really it now is a matter of public debate rather than something that happens in the shadows and is hinted at. I think this is what the beginning of accountability looks like. It looks like our courts exercising jurisdiction over claims brought by people our country has wronged. It looks like a system in which no one is above the law, in which even people who know all kinds of very scary secrets still have to submit to depositions when they're involved in torture. For years, the government fought tooth and nail to prevent this type of inquiry. But there are also people within the government who are people of goodwill, and I think sensed the real danger posed when, at the end of 8 years of not having a torture program, one of the two candidates says he wants to get it right back. This case demonstrates that torture is not too secret for our courts, and I think it's also part of what a path forward would look like. I recognize that civil litigation will not solve everything. We have a lot more to do to account for torture. I happen to think that criminal prosecution actually would be appropriate. I recognize that maybe in a government that was struggling with legitimacy in 2008, that might not have been possible. I think an outgoing appointment of a special prosecutor for crimes where the statute of limitations has not run, I don't think that would tear our country apart. I think at this stage we can handle it. More importantly, though, we've completely failed the victims of torture, most of whom can't go through civil litigation to try to get some recompense, and all of whom are struggling with rehabilitation, with recognition for what they went through. I can tell you that for my clients, just having their name in the Senate torture report was enormous for them. It was a huge moment to say the Senate of the United States has recognized that I was subjected to this. And we should go further. We should appoint an independent body that adjudicates claims, that provides compensation, apologies, rehabilitation. That's just a minimum that we need to provide to atone. And then finally, to sort of build on both Jeremy and Mark, I think we do need to somehow institutionalize the resistance to torture, the same resistance that the people who kept it secret feared so much, that they feared that if other people saw what they were doing, they would shut it down. They may or may not have been right, but I think we have to try to strengthen the hand of those who would shut it down. And so people like Alberto Mora, they should be honored. They're American heroes. They're people who, faced with a hysteria and a fear that seemed to justify anything as long as it was inflicted on others, they still said no. They said, this is not who we are. This is not what we do. This is illegal. It's obviously illegal, and I won't be part of it. And few people did that, but the people who did should be recognized. They should be held up. And perhaps that will inspire others in the future to act as that kind of backstop. And finally, one thing that, it's true that Donald Trump, the Republican nominee, has said numerous times that he would order the CIA to commit torture, that he's also an enthusiast, I think, of an array of other questionably legal national security decisions, like killing the families of terrorists. However, the CIA has publicly resisted this in a way that perhaps not extraordinary, it's probably what we should expect from the CIA, but they've done so in public, and they've said, we don't feel protected anymore. And if we were ordered to do this, we wouldn't do it again, not necessarily because of a moral objection, but for the simple fact that we don't feel like the American government will stand behind us if we go and commit these illegal activities. That's a very good thing. They shouldn't feel protected. They shouldn't feel that they can act with impunity so long as they receive orders from someone like Donald Trump or Dick Cheney or anyone else. And so that's positive. If we were to take a public opinion poll, perhaps we'd still lose. Perhaps if we had a constitutional referendum on the institution of torture, perhaps a majority of Americans would vote for it. I don't know, but there are currently laws, as Mark ably described, multiple laws preventing it. And the more we keep this in the public eye, that there are laws, it is illegal, people who say no should be applauded, and people who don't say no should not be able to just walk away from it, then I think this story might end a little more hopefully. Thanks.
Thank you, Dror, for your reflections on the way lawyers like yourself can uphold the constitutional rights and values that are at the heart of the U.S. Republic. Our next speaker is Robert Cole, Emeritus Professor at the University of California School of Law, Boalt Hall. Since 2010, Bob and I have created symposia at law schools in order to address the role of lawyers and psychologists in condoning and facilitating the practice of torture in the United States by agents of the United States. From my perspective, Bob, you're the most important achievement to date in this process because you've changed my opinions about lawyers in a very positive direction. So please welcome Bob Cole.
Well, I'm not worried about being a torture bore. I'm much more worried about just being a bore. But I'll try to move along, and these are tough acts to follow. What I want to do is talk about the ethics of giving advice to the government, legal advice to the government at the highest level about torture. And what I'd like to conclude with is that the lessons we can learn from this apply to all of you who are law students in whatever legal role you're going to have in the future. But we'll come to that at the end. The torture that we've been talking about is designed to extract information. And the first thing that an ethical lawyer would do in giving advice on this subject is to go over what it is we do already know about coerced interrogations. And there are two general models of thinking about coerced interrogations. One model is what I call the government program model. And the government program that we know about is law enforcement. And we have in the Bill of Rights and in our practice a whole set of restrictions on coerced interrogation. We have self-incrimination privilege, unreasonable searches and seizures. We have laws about bodily extractions. We have laws about coerced confessions. We have laws about the prisoner being allowed to remain silent and have a lawyer. All of these add up to what you might say is a set of what's allowable in view of all those restraints is a very modest set of intrusions. Basically, you can't do intrusions on people's privacy or body under this body of law that are immoderate or that are essentially unconventional. I mean, these are what's allowed. Of course, we care a lot about all the details of a warrant and a search and so on, but looking at them from a bigger picture, they're roughly all within the conventional understanding of the public. And secondly, what's important to see about the government program of law enforcement is that under this program, we are willing to forego information that is obtained improperly. So in other words, we have a system of very minor, let's take away the very minor intrusions. I mean, when you're there in the police station, it's scary as hell. I don't want to minimize that. But if we compare this to slamming you against the wall, chaining you up for hours, having you spend days with incessant noise, incessant light, squatting for hours on end, being put into a little box, being waterboarded, that torture, these examples are a totally different moral universe from what is allowed, and anything beyond what is allowed under the government program of law enforcement, the information is foregone. There's a commitment in the Constitution and in our law not to get information and not to use it if it's gotten improperly. Now, what underlies these Bill of Rights protections in law enforcement is initially, you might say, a concept of consent, but underlying the whole thing is the notion that personhood is inviolable. There is some irreducible personhood that simply cannot be violated. And I think myself, that is the core principle of our legal system. It starts with persons, and you can build up from that. Now, the second model is that we have about coerced interrogation is a self-defense and necessity model, which the law students here will know about from the common law. And under this model, the prisoner is the offensive person. We are doing self-defense against the prisoner. How is that? Because he's withholding information from us. And by withholding us, he's a threat to us. So we have to deal with him as a matter of self-defense. That's the other model. Now, the common law of self-defense has a high set of thresholds before you can use force to defend yourself. And what we're talking about here is using force to defend ourselves against the silence of these prisoners who don't want to speak. First of all, the threat has to be very serious, very specific, and very immediate. Secondly, the response has to be proportional. You can't use excessive force, and if there are less onerous alternatives that you could use to protect yourself, you have to do those. We are in a state right now where some states have this stand your ground law, which is really a retrenchment from this common law tradition. And then there's liability under self-defense and necessity law to innocent third persons. So those thresholds are very different, and again, a completely different moral universe from the kind of interrogation we're trying to do as self-defense against people whom you don't know what their connections are with people who may or may not be planning things, and they may or may not be planning these things as acts of terrorism. In other words, you have a very low level of specificity and clarity when you're trying to, as compared to the law of self-defense, when you're trying to interrogate prisoners. So now, what's happened in our society, the memos, the legal advice that authorized what we now call torture, the Bush administration's rhetoric, and now the public's understanding, I think, what has happened here to these two models, the model of government program and the model of self-defense, is that they have both become dissolved into the idea of war. Some kind of war against terrorism is what the rhetoric is. In other words, the government program is not law enforcement now, it's conducting a war against somebody. And self-defense is now all-encompassing, because if you're conducting a war against somebody, then everything offensive that you do to them is really in your self-defense. So self-defense and a government program of have become simply a matter of war. And what the government's policies and what the lawyers have said is that building on this idea of war, they have been able to finesse the limits that they ought to be respecting. So what should an ethical, I mean, I'll come back to their legal opinions a little bit later, but what should an ethical legal opinion be about the question of torture? And another way to put this is to say, how would you define your advisory role? How do you define your role as a counselor to your client in a situation where you're asked to give an opinion about the legality of harsh interrogation methods? Well, the first thing that's required ethically is competent legal analysis. You have to, and what do you do if you want to, instead of dissolving all the questions into a question of war, but in fact you want to deal with the government program model and the self-defense model, what you have to do is extrapolate from them, from what we know and from the situations that we're familiar with, by degrees to the current situation that you're being asked to give advice about. You're going to do a careful extrapolation from what you do know. And in doing that, you have to take account of, in giving us competent legal advice, you have to take account of the fundamental importance of personhood. That can't be read out of a legal analysis. You have to try to deconstruct the vagueness of war into, well, what functionally is it that we're trying to achieve here, and how are we justified in getting what kind of information at what cost? You have to think about the possibility that we're committing war crimes ourselves. So you have to do a competent legal analysis. The second thing, you can make a brief for what the client wants to do, but only against the background of having made a competent legal analysis. You could say, well, we can make this argument for you, but here are the problems. You can't just write a brief and say, you can do this, you can do that, which is what the lawyers actually did do. So the second thing you have to do is to address, I think, ethically, the risks involved in what the government is proposing to do. And when the client is the White House, the very highest level of government, then the stakes are extremely high, and therefore the risks are extremely great. And so it seems to me, in being asked to evaluate the legality of a particular course of conduct, to do what we call torture now, they didn't call it that then, you have to look at the consequences, the adverse consequences of that. You have to ask the client and make sure the client has thought about what the moral posture of the country would be, what the legal consequences would be for what they're doing, whether there would be retaliation from other countries, what we would lose in terms of our international standing. These are risks that you have to take account of. Then you have to take account of whether there are alternatives. You have to say to the client, have you thought out whether there are alternatives to torture that are just as effective or more effective, or how effective would they be, how much would you lose? The client has to think about that if he wants to make a decision here. And then lawyers are very good at thinking up safeguards. And so you would think up safeguards in an ethical legal opinion. You would say, well, we have to have some time limits on what you're thinking about. We want to know what the chain of command is going to be in terms of how you're going to hold people accountable, how you're going to make sure you don't go over the line. So that's the kind of content that you need to put into a legal opinion on a subject like this, which is so high risk. And then finally, you have to think about your role as a counselor in the historic tradition of lawyers. And it's part of the lawyer's job, in my view. We all know the lawyers have to be detached. From that, I think you have to realize that a lawyer has to be detached from the passions of the moment. He has to look at the longer view, or she has to look at the longer view. She has to be detached from the urgent needs of the client. That's the only way you can protect people, is through detachment. And we have lots of experience with this. The Communist Party cases in the 1950s and 60s, people got, especially in the 50s, they got swept away by passions when they shouldn't have. The Japanese relocation cases in the 40s, people were swept away by the passion of war, and they lost sight of what the Constitution obviously, clearly required. So now, in terms of then of this competent legal advice on the law and the risk management and the counselor's role, the torture is an easy case. I mean, analytically, I'm not going to go through that now. Maybe we can talk about it more of it. There's no way that you can set, torture isn't just one case of one guy doing something to somebody, it's a system, and there's no way that system can come close to satisfying these values that I've talked about. And I'm just going to ask you to take my word for that. The memos that the government lawyers wrote to justify the torture that they did justify, and that unleashed it authorized all the stuff that you just heard about. Those memos are also an easy target. They were simply a one-sided hired gun opinion that did not take account of the whole context that you need to take account of. They didn't do any of the things that I just suggested about risks and the lawyer's role. And what they did was use a very bad form of legal reasoning, which some of you law students probably have encountered in older cases, where they simply reasoned by definition. And so they said, well, if this is war, there's a concept, then by definition there are no limits on what the president can do. Well, this is false anyway. And then secondly, they said, if something is not torture, they say, well, we have to define torture. So they find a very narrow slice of behavior that is torture. Then anything else that isn't torture, by definition, you can do. But that's not right. But that's the danger of doing reasoning by definition. And so on every ground, these opinions were incompetent, and they were found to be incompetent by the Office of Professional Responsibility and Justice Department, and that recommendation that the authors of those opinions be disciplined was overruled by the Deputy Attorney General, Assistant Attorney General, to which that office reported. Now, I've said what I thought should be an ethical legal advice. Why is what I said ethically required? What's the ethical theory that justifies what I just said? Well, first of all, one kind of ethical justification is your role ethics, the established rules and guidelines for what lawyers are supposed to do. So that's within your role ethics, you have to be competent. So there's no real ethical argument about that. And also within your role ethics, you have to understand who the client is. And in institutions like this, it's not the incumbent who's the client, it's the office. Now, you can argue about this in terms of the nuances, but that's the general idea. And if you're going to argue for the office, you can't be just a hired gun, because the office has got all kinds of institutional obligations that go back in history, that go forward, that go sideways, that involve all kinds of constituents. You can't reduce that any more than a corporate lawyer can reduce the corporation to the CEO. You can't just do what the CEO wants if you're representing the corporation. And this is the same kind of thing. So that's just role ethics. Now, beyond the role itself, the second kind of ethical justification for the type of opinion that I advocated one should have to write here is an out-of-role ethics that you bring to your role. You as a person, you bring your own outside ethics to the role. But one outside ethic that you would bring to the role, I think, is your commitment to the role. The legal rules of legal ethics don't say you must love your job, but you can have an ethical view yourself that I care about the fundamental values of my job. And I call that the integrity, or the integrity of commitment. And so if you believe in the founding premise of personhood, and if you believe in the common law and the constitutional law, which I tried very quickly to summarize, and if you believe in disinterestedness and thoughtful counseling, then it seems to me you would say, well, I can't just give a hired gun or a narrow legal analysis. I have to include these other things. That's part of my commitment as a person to my role. And then the third ethical basis for what I said is what you might call consequentialism, not in a bad sense and not utilitarianism, but the idea that you have to think sensibly and reasonably and carefully about risks, and your client is dependent on you. And so you've got to take account of the fact that you don't want her to run risks, or at least you want her to know the risk that she's running. That's part of your job. So your job in protecting your client against adverse consequences is a kind of legal theory. And so the point is that the reasons you ought to give that you ethically ought to give the kind of opinion that I was trying to describe and which was not given, they're based on a kind of a mixed ethical theory of role, commitment to the role, and common sense, let's say, consequentialism. And there's nothing exotic or idiosyncratic about that. That's just pretty conventional. So to adopt an ethical theory which leads you to adopt a certain kind of ethical opinion writing, that's not hard to do under a relatively modest, conventional ethical theory like this. It's pretty obvious. What are the lessons for the future? Jeremy titled our thing, Lessons for the Future. Well, we do have to think about drones and assassinations and surveillance and ticking bombs. And so one lesson is that the same kind of legal advice has got to be given for those kinds of things. And we ought to know what the legal advice is that's being given. Part of the secrecy that seems very difficult to accept is why the lawyer's opinion should be kept secret. And that's sort of part of that's just public discussion. That's just public policy. There's a second lesson for the future is one I started with, which is that to you law students who are here in particular, that it's up to you to decide what your advisory posture is going to be. What kind of a counselor are you going to be? And you cannot decide that by just looking at the legal rules. You have to have an outside ethics. There's no other way you can do it. And you either don't have an ethics and it goes by default, or you consciously think about it. And so I would urge you consciously to think about what kind of a lawyer do I want to be ethically? And finally, it does take guts to stand up to your client. It does take guts to say to the president, you can't do this. But that is what a lawyer is supposed to have. You're detached, and you're supposed to bring guts to the situation. So somebody said, I don't know who said it, but a lot of us, I think maybe all of us understand it. You can't be the land of the free unless you're going to be the home of the brave.
Thanks, Bob, for your wisdom. I'm just so impressed whenever you speak. And also for reminding us of the ethical responsibilities of lawyers, the guidelines necessary for personhood to be held inviolable. At this point, as the one mental health professional on this panel, I'll make a few remarks on the psychological implications for a society that does not hold its leaders accountable for torture. The social psychology experiment Philip Zimbardo and I completed in 2014 gave a more nuanced interpretation to the standard understanding of Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment. To summarize, the norms of social behavior are established from the top down in organizations, either expressed explicitly, as in the instructions given subjects to abuse in Stanley Milgram's experiment, or expressed implicitly and non-verbally, as in Zimbardo's experiment. Abuse does not appear randomly from below, but is set in motion by authorities from above in organizational hierarchies. This is true for criminal behavior committed by the armed services and agents of the U.S. government, whether in My Lai, Abu Ghraib, or Guantanamo. As reported by James Rison in his book, Pay Any Price, the 2014 report of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence showed that the American Psychological Association's Presidential Task Force on Psychological Ethics and National Security, or PENS for short, was a rigged system designed to provide cover for Pentagon and CIA torture. As Jean Maria Arrigo, a member of that task force, stated at our 2010 symposium at Berkeley Law, the CIA wanted a get-out-of-jail-free card prior to their interrogation and torture tactics on prisoners. And this they received from the psychological community. How is it that the American Psychological Association, the premier psychological association in the United States, proved to be so vulnerable to the seduction by powerful authorities, even though following this path violated the most basic ideals and norms of the professional community? For a partial answer to this, we turn to the work of Robert J. Lifton, a distinguished psychiatrist who, for much of his long career, has studied how medical professionals in the Third Reich came to participate in atrocities. Lifton asked the question, how could the most cultured and scientifically progressive society in Europe be seduced by a creed so inimical to their stated values? Lifton studied the doctors who committed war crimes and were prosecuted at the 1945 Nuremberg trials. He concluded that the Nazi doctors were not monsters, not inherently evil, nor were they abnormal in any other respects from their fellow countrymen and women. Like other Germans of the time, they had been gradually socialized to accept the incremental cruelty that was inflicted on people identified by their government as enemies. As the abuses and crimes multiplied, the Nazi doctors and their fellow citizens followed the step-by-step undoing of the ethical code that stood between themselves and a barbarism of the most fiendish kind. In the United States, we the people must not allow such a gradual socialization to evil to occur. But in the absence of accountability by U.S. authorities, how long before we, like German citizens in the last century, become accustomed to horrors and excuse atrocities done with our tax dollars, whether through wars of choice, extrajudicial killing, or torture? Mark Danner, in his Spiral, Trapped in the Forever War, quotes President Obama in 2013 address, acknowledging the dark possibility of such a radical transformation of our society. And this is the quote: "Perpetual war through drones or special forces or troop deployments will prove self-defeating and alter our country in troubling ways." End of quote. The failure to hold people accountable for torture only abets the gradual socialization toward evil. What was once explicit prohibitions against torture becomes an implicit forgiveness, not only of torture, but other crimes against humanity. There is an implicit message from the highest authorities that you will not be punished or held accountable. You will, in a deep psychological sense, be forgiven by the most powerful authorities in the land. Once the crime is forgiven, the offense is forgotten. All the more reason it will be repeated. This difference between what is explicit and what is implicit is crucial to understanding how authorities at the highest level can induce their subordinates to abuse and break long-held ethical taboos. Thus, the September 17, 2001 Memorandum of Notification by the Executive Branch greenlighting torture will not be judged, nor will the authors of the Office of Legal Counsel's memo of August 1, 2002 be sanctioned. Neither will the responsible leaders of the American Psychological Association have to answer for their acquiescence and silence while torture was being carried out with their imprimatur. So we return to Robert J. Lifton's question: what happens to a people who become socialized to social evils? We, the people, may be living that social experiment in the United States today. Now, I want to begin our panel discussion, and I'll start with a question for Mark and ask others to join in and respond as well. In the book I just mentioned, Spiral, the Forever Unending War, if I got the right title, you write eloquently of the state of exception and the forever war in which we find ourselves as a nation. How do you envision this state of exception ever coming to an end?
Goodness, I feel an obligation to travel some distance from my bleakness. It feels to me as if there is a bleak side up here and a kind of less bleak side. And the less bleak side is held up very well by Dror and Bob Cole, and I want to be on that side. But I'm not. You know, it seems to me Dror set out very well this notion of a movement toward accountability that is going on. It's just going on gradually. It's going on in particular cases. And it's based really on sunshine, on the metaphor of, what is it? Sunshine is the best, what is it? The best disinfectant, yes. My mother always liked that phrase. She was a clean nut. Sunshine is the best disinfectant. And the notion is that the key to this is secrecy. And of course, the great gamble here, and Dror, I thought, very responsibly mentioned that, is that we might find when all these things become public that in fact the majority of the population is willing to support them. And that essentially looks like it's quite possible. And that there's a basic liberal position, really, and it's one to which journalists, which I mostly am, are particularly open or particularly prone, and that is secrecy is really the problem when wrongdoing is going on. If you can expose the wrongdoing, the society itself will take care of it. And this model was really given its most brilliant embodiment in the Watergate era. And it's no accident, I think, that it's that era in which I grew up. I mean, that's the first strong political memory I have, is watching those hearings, the Watergate hearings, as my mother was telling me to go out and play, and stop sitting in front of the television. But Watergate really embodied that notion that if you had this corruption within the government, eventually, if it was exposed, the people would rise up and they would investigate, they would levy punishment eventually, and the wrongdoing would be expiated. And my problem, and forgive me for the length of this answer, but it's a really kind of a personal question in a funny way to me, is that I don't see that happening now, that cycle of exposure, investigation, and expiation, that sort of tripartite thing that was exemplified by Watergate isn't really happening when it comes to torture. And indeed, there are other policies that have been mentioned very scantly today. Bill just mentioned drones, as Bob did as well, that are part of our daily policy. We have a policy of assassination. It's been, so far as I can tell, accepted by the country. We've probably killed 5,000 people, roughly, through drone attacks. A significant portion of those are civilians, and we've accepted it. And I fear, to get back to Bill's question, that we've adopted a kind of warfare that is manageable both economically and morally. In our moral economy, we are not stretched by it. If we're going to kill every few days somebody in the mountains of Pakistan or Afghanistan or Yemen, or even now Libya or Somalia, it's okay, as long as they're far away and we're not putting American pilots at risk. There's an Israeli phrase, or word, I think it's Batash, you'll maybe correct me on that. Batash, B-A-T-A-S-H, present security, current security. It essentially means it's a state of not peace and not war. The harsher Israeli phrase, and it's used also by American policymakers too lately, is mowing the grass. We've got to mow the grass. And that means killing a few people, keeping these organizations at bay, killing a few more, and so on. And if what I'm saying is the case, if this is the present reality and could be the reality into the future, I don't know when I could point to an ending, because for one thing, politicians will not have an interest in necessarily providing an ending, because the risks of a large-scale terrorist attack on American soil will be much greater than the risk of continuing this present security regime. Now, torture obviously might be part of that, or it might not be part of that. And I'd like to adopt Dror's more optimistic point of view when it comes to the gradual lifting of secrecy and the gradual move toward accountability as he sees it. But the thing I would have to remind him and other people here is that we've known about torture. There was a piece on the front page of the Washington Post on December 26th, 2002, about stress and duress techniques. And we've known about it, the broad society has known about it since 2004 in Abu Ghraib. So there may indeed be, and there is obviously strong legal advancement when, and perhaps I hope that will continue. But it also seems the case that to some degree, as we have become more aware of these things, we have become more accepting of them. And that, it seems to me, is a fact about our politics and our public policy.
Do others on the panel want to comment on this unending war as rationale for scuttling values? Yes, Jeremy, go ahead.
Very briefly, I agree with everything that's been said, but would ask us to remind each other and the audience that we did think a little bit about modest solutions rather than apocalyptic ending solutions. And the modest solutions in various ways involve building up layers of resistance, often institutionalized resistance, among those who are not leading the struggle in the unending war, but who are going to be nevertheless constituting the fabric of the government. So the institutionalization of safeguards, the development of strong, resilient structures for government lawyers in accordance with the line that Bob set out, the development of structures of publicity and the undermining of secrecy, generally the establishment of structures of the rule of law, so that just as with, I use the analogy with the police abuse, the third degree, it wasn't that crime went away and therefore that stopped. It was despite the persistence and in some cases the alarming spike in crime from the 60s, 70s and 80s. Nevertheless, the third degree, though it didn't disappear entirely, became uncharacteristic of police practice and became uncharacteristic because things were routinized, institutions were set up, training was changed so that there were these layers of resistance to abusive tactics.
Who promoted these institutional changes? That is, why did they gain traction?
I don't know the detailed answer to that. I know who does have it.
But just, what do you think generally?
I do know the person who knows this, which is our former colleague, Jerry Skolnick, who wrote a book with Jim Fife called Excessive Use of Force. And I think his view was that a number of strategists, sort of Bratton-level strategists in policing, decided that there were ways of combating this that wouldn't involve waiting for the unending war to end. There was always going to be crime, but there would be a different professionalization, a different institutionalization among the police force. Not perfect, and it won't be perfect among intelligence operatives either, but I think that all five of us spoke about that, and we should hang on to that as one of the takeaway messages, that we need to routinize the safeguards, even if we can't routinize the threats that we're facing.
But if it's true the authorities at the highest levels must be the ones passing these norms down. How do we reach those people?
Well, it may well be that you can't or can't as easily, but what the authorities will say will be partly a function of what's said to them by those through whom orders are being transmitted. I'm a strong believer that, apart from the difficulties of legitimization of the particular presidency in 2008, that there's a case for prosecuting low-level perpetrators, whether or not you can prosecute the high-level people. And I don't believe that all abuse at the lower intermediate level only comes in response to signals from the top. But one possibility is that people at the high level will interfere with and spoil the structures that I'm talking about. Another possibility is that they won't, and they'll just find that their options are narrowed by that structures. But sunshine is one disinfectant. Good institutionalization is another, and we should not underestimate just the sort of the boring, hard tasks of establishing routines and training that make some difference to this.
Dror, would you like to add something to that?
Sure. I'll just say that I don't want to suggest that, reduction in torture or even a successful bar on torture carries with it an end to the state of exception that we find ourselves in with regard to so much else. We are a country that has decided that war footing is the appropriate response, not to a particular enemy, but to a particular tactic, and that tactic being terrorism. And that's about as hard, it seems to me, to not last forever as the war on poverty or the war, these are concepts, they're not enemies. And so to the extent that that is a war and carries with it the state of exception that wars carry with them, then yes, we will continue to have problems defining limits in every capacity, in detention, in drones, and anything else that comes with a war. That said, I do think that there is particular value in drawing red lines. I'm hopeful that those red lines will go so far as to bring in detention without end, as to bring in targeted killing. But I think at a minimum, they have to bring in things that we have abhorred for centuries, like torture. And I think moving closer to that, while not ending in any way the broader abuses of a national security state, at least puts some of our moral grounding back.
Mm-hmm. Could I add something?
Sure, go ahead. It's open discussion.
Well, Bill quoted some words from Barack Obama from my book Spiral, and one of the fascinating things to me about Obama is that he recognizes, as he put it, that this perpetual war must someday end. Great quotation. I mean, he recognizes that it must end, and it's clear. The same press conference on his second full day in office that he prohibited torture, he also vowed to close Guantanamo within a year. Not only vowed, but ordered the government through an executive order to do that. So his predicament and his actions as a leader during this perpetual war are fascinating and troubling, because I think there is part of him, and you see it in a line of speeches right through his presidency, that wants to indeed get rid of the authorization for the use of military force and do various other things that would take us from a state of war to a more normalized state where terrorist acts would be treated as they used to be treated, which is as violations of the law, not as that's a little bit too simple. But anyway, to bring us back, put it this way, to the status quo ante, and he has not been able to do that, and he clearly is starting to recognize that he won't be able to do it by the end of his presidency. One other comment, which is there's a third possibility from the two that Jeremy was citing a second ago, and that is that there's another terrorist attack, which is a very large one on American soil, And the question is, I mean, the things that are going on now, the moves towards accountability, slow and steady as they are, the moves toward transparency and so on, are happening at a time when the threat is perceived to have lifted to some degree. And the real question to me is, what will happen if you have an attack on American soil that is, we're talking about in the hundreds of people, or I don't know what exactly it would take. What would that do to these actions? And whatever president is in power, but particularly on the Republican side, it seems to me would be under great pressure to reinstitute enhanced interrogation techniques, at least from his political constituency. That doesn't mean there wouldn't be objections and resistance from within the government, and possibly that would be decisive. I don't know. Actually, Trump, Dror pointed this out, that at the end of his talk, that after Trump said this publicly about torture, the CIA essentially said we wouldn't do this. And it's a fascinating notion to see whether there would be that kind of struggle. Trump's response, I should add, was, if I tell them to do it, they'll do it, which bears thinking about. Do you want the CIA simply to say, no, we won't do this? And one other comment I wanted to make very briefly, which is that these torture memos, the idea that this wouldn't become public is arguable to some extent, because these torture memos were really about people being able to duck prosecution. I think there was an assumption, and it's just not just me, I mean, CIA people have said it. There's actually a quote to this effect in my book, that the memos were drafted with an eye toward the eventual public knowledge and public prosecution of torture cases. And I think the CIA was anticipating this, which is why there's an odd notion when the Senate report came out, you see the CIA constantly managing the public impression of this program and trying to persuade the public that it's successful with an eye toward eventual consequences. So it was secret and being publicized in a very selective way at the same time. Yeah.
Just very briefly on that point, it is a fascinating aspect of it, the reason why the memos were crafted in the first place. And you do see throughout the life of the program an enormous effort by the people who are involved in it to make sure that they constantly got the Department of Justice to say, you're not going to be prosecuted. Originally, they even sought an advanced declination of prosecution, which is an extraordinary document that John Rizzo drafted up and presented to Chertoff, who said, we won't do that, but don't worry, no one's going to be prosecuted. I just want to push back a little bit against the notion that they thought that this would become public. I mean, I think they were looking to cover themselves in case it did, but there's also just incredible cables that were revealed in that Senate report for the people who are going back and forth with their very first victim, Abu Zubaydah, and they're going back and forth on how he is to be tortured. And at some point, there's these extraordinary documents, which are cables from American officials to each other saying, there's a consensus that he must never be allowed to speak to another human again. If he dies, we need to incinerate his body so that no one sees what we did to him. But if he survives, we need guarantees that he will be isolated for the rest of his life from anyone. And that, there was, they wanted to have it both ways, and I agree that they had a backup plan, which was these memos, but I don't think that they really thought they'd be scrutinized.
Well, I want to open the discussion to our audience that's been very attentively listening. I'm so impressed, so few of you left. So it was the cookies, yes. All right, so I'll invite questions from the audience. Questions or comments? You can make comments as well. Yes, go ahead. Please speak into your microphone and hit your little speak button.
Yes. Thank you all for this wonderful talk. I have one comment and one question. So the comment is recalling Professor Roller's your account on the Nazi doctors. I think it's interesting to note that there is a sort of a moral analog to the problem of the problem that the account of the Nazi doctors, which we owe to the most important political theorist of the 20th century, Hannah Arendt, and it's a concept of the venality of evil. So the idea that sort of evil becomes trivial in exceptional conditions or in war conditions. But the problem, of course, of the venality of evil is that, or the problem for this we are discussing right now is that we might conclude that we're all victims in some way. We're all victims of the exceptional conditions, both the torturers and the victims. We're all victims of the exceptional conditions of war. But still, I think it's interesting to know that there is a sort of a counterpart to the psychological problem in the moral or the more normative dimension. So that was the comment. The question is addressed to Professor Cole. Professor Danner mentioned Watergate. And Watergate was important for many reasons, but it had a profound impact on the legal ethics regulations. And so the question is, if so, drawing on that parallel, would you expect, after sort of a process of transitional justice, would you expect some form of impact, concrete impact on sort of legal regulation of legal ethics, or some reaction on the American Bar Association?
Sorry. Watergate was, I think most of you were not here then, but Watergate was a big spectacle. And it was on television, and it involved the president and all kinds of character actors who were actually senators and so on. And so it got a tremendous amount of publicity. And many of the miscreants in the Watergate story were lawyers. And so the bar, got it. It lit a fire under the bar, and the bar associations did things. They instituted requirements for legal ethics. They didn't used to have it required in law school curricula. And so there was you're right, there was a genuine reaction in the law profession to Watergate. I don't think that the torture situation is similar. It hasn't gotten that kind of publicity. I think there are a lot of people who are easily made afraid, and I think that people who are afraid don't object to torture so much. They should, but they don't. And so I don't think that the torture itself, this is just a guess, I don't think it's going to percolate into the legal profession enough. There have been statements by bar associations and so on, but the principal guy who wrote these memos is a guy named John Yu, who I'm horrified to say is on the same faculty that I'm on, and he's basically been rewarded in his career. And his boss was a guy named Jay Bybee. He was appointed to the Ninth Circuit. So, I mean, we have counter-accountability in a way here. And I think it's because there are some factors that everybody in every law student will say torture is bad. But there's some factors that seem to me, I'm not an expert on this, that have made it less of a impetus to reform. It's too bad. It ought to be an impetus.
There's a question from this young lady here.
Hello, I'm sorry. I was very interested in your remarks about the public getting used to evil, or the sliding scale of the public getting used to evil.
Socialization is the term.
Socialization. Mm-hmm. And with respect to that, I remember that you mentioned that none of the victims had gotten an apology from the United States. And so, being German, it felt to me that a huge part of the German resocialization away from evil was that the German government acknowledges and apologizes for what has been done. So I wanted to ask, what do you think has to be done to get back on the right track, away from the socialization towards evil, and whether apologies or acknowledgements of wrongdoing play any part in that?
I believe that's true. I think Robert J. Lifton, who I studied closely, would say that as well. Certainly reparations, financial reparations, as well as psychological treatment if necessary, and very many of these people who have been tortured need psychological treatment. Yes, and apologies go a long way because it's an acknowledgement there's been wrongdoing. I noticed that President Obama was in Hiroshima not too long ago, and he's still saying that, no apologies there for that event. So, yes, I agree. Did you want to hear a response from others? Any other comments on that, folks? Yeah, go ahead, Jeremy.
Apology sometimes takes on a life of its own as a particular ritual. For some reason, it's seen as impolitic for President Obama to speak the actual language of apology. Mm-hmm. But there are lots of other things that one can do without using that term. There are public expressions of repentance.
Repentance is a good term. Yes. How do you repent? Yeah.
I think that's right. And it doesn't have to be the performative, I repent, but it can be a series of things that are said which communicate unambiguously that wrong was done.
Exactly.
And that we are aware of it, and we who did it are aware of it. And to find a variety, a cornucopia of devices, locutions, and so on that can do that in public, I think is a very good thing. So that it doesn't just become the formulaic business of...
Precisely.
Yeah.
Yeah, well said. Thank you, Jeremy. The lady back there. Yes, you. Thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk today. It was said on the panel that there's this sort of surprise that after the exposure of wrongdoing that people didn't respond, and that there's been more counter-accountability than accountability. And I was wondering if the panel could speak to the idea that perhaps this is because there's been a vilification of the people who were subjected to the torture, and that, even in American society today, we see constantly the otherization of Muslims and South Asians, and should there be more of an effort to humanize the survivors of the torture program? And you might be aware that NYU, the Global Justice Clinic, represents a survivor of the torture program, Muhammad al-Assad, and there's, discussions in that program as to how he can be humanized as not just a survivor, but a former businessman, someone who was very charitable. And so that was my first question. And my second question was, I've read that President Obama has engaged in proxy detention, and he sort of pushed the rendition program into this legal abyss, and asked other countries to hold and torture suspected terrorists at his behest. And I was wondering what provisions in international law could hold the U.S. accountable for that new transformation or evolution of the torture program.
Could I say one thing about your first question? I'm sure you're right about what you said. I don't know it as an expert, but I wanted to make a footnote to what you just said, which is that both legally and in terms of public rhetoric, people talk as if there's a difference between, let's say, assassinating an American citizen abroad and assassinating some foreigner abroad. Let's say an Arab target. Now, in my view, I don't see any difference between the two. That I don't see any legal basis, for instance, for saying that you need to be more careful in assassinating an American than you do to assassinating a foreigner. It seems to me in both cases you're dealing with persons. And what the law that really restrains us, taking off from what I said in my talk, is a law that we're committed to about the treatment of people as persons. So I think to the extent that you can rhetorically convince the American public that there's a difference between the people who are like us and are persons and people who aren't like us and they're not persons, then you're running the very risks that you said. It seems to me it's a big mistake to, and I don't see any real basis in American law for thinking of people who are other, not citizens, not Americans, not white, whatever the category is, as somehow a fairer game.
Yes, it's actually an ongoing scapegoating process that takes on a life of its own once a group is defined as an enemy. Dror, did you want to speak to the second point?
Sure, yeah. Very briefly, so I think just to make sure I've understood correctly, there was one of the things that's tragic about the legacy of the torture program is that we now have a very good account of people who were held in U.S. prisons, whether they were secret CIA prisons or to a lesser degree, some accounting for what happened, say at Bagram or at Abu Ghraib or at other Department of Defense facilities. There was an additional program that didn't even begin during the Bush years, but was a practice that existed during Clinton's time as well. That's President Bill Clinton, of sending people through this process called rendition that later became nicknamed extraordinary rendition, when you were sending people specifically with the idea that they would be tortured by other regimes. So the holding by the US of prisoners and subjecting them to torture is not something that has continued during the Obama years. The process of rendition, it's not a new one, it has continued, but I don't have information as to whether the Obama administration is sending people for the purpose of proxy torture. I haven't seen, evidence of that. There, in terms of the question you were asking about the legal prohibitions on it, the really key one is the Convention Against Torture, which prohibits what they call refoulement. So it's sending someone back, whether they're someone that you've detained for some reason, whether they're an asylum seeker at your shores, whether they're a criminal who has to be deported. There's a absolute prohibition on returning someone to a country in which they will be tortured. Now, that's all well and good. As we also know, there were clear prohibitions on torture, and so people have a way of ignoring prohibitions. One of the ways people have ignored prohibitions is through the process of something called diplomatic assurances, in which a country will assure us that they will not torture the person we are sending them. And there have been hard-fought battles, including by the Obama administration, to prevent courts from reviewing those diplomatic assurances, from reviewing any credibility of a representation by a regime that does engage in torture, that in this time they won't. It's a big issue. You're right to be concerned about it. But as to the scope of its existence under the Obama administration, I think we still have to have more information. We need to learn about that.
This young lady right in the front, thank you.
Thank you so much for a very interesting talk. So I have one comment and then a question. The comment is about the sort of the development of the prohibition against torture, the sort of history of the norm, because I think that maybe we've sort of taken for granted the fragility of the norm to a certain extent from a historical perspective. So the Convention Against Torture went into effect in 1987, which is relatively recently. If obviously for hundreds of thousands of years, torture was practiced, and then you had sort of a gradual development in the 17th and 18th century of this prohibition against the norm. A lot of it was very pragmatic, right? So not as principled, but more these notions of, is it really an effective tool from a law enforcement perspective? You had the norm, so that prohibition developed 17th, 18th, 19th century, and in the 20th century, you see torture sort of return in a big way. You have the fascist states, then you have Chile, the United States, the policing that Professor Waldron mentioned, the UK using torture against the IRA. So it returned in this big way. And the Nazis were obviously the tipping point, but even then it took another 20 to 30 years. I think it was in the early 70s that this movement really developed to take this prohibition and actually turn it into some sort of international convention. So that's, I think, very interesting that, that the historical development of this norm is relatively recent. So 1987, the convention goes into effect, and then very much less than 20 years later, we have the United States only 6 days after September 11th deciding that it was no longer going to abide by that. So I think thinking about the fragility of the norm and not taking for granted its sort of well-established nature, although morally we can all, I think, agree how disgusting and distasteful the idea of torture is from a legal perspective, thinking about its more cabined history, I think, is maybe interesting in terms of this discussion. Why was that sort of one of the first norms to go out the window after September 11th happened? And then my question is about, Professor Waldron's comments about this sort of taking an incremental approach, putting in safeguards when it comes to torture. And you used, again, the U.S. police as an example, and talked about how even during times of sort of increasing crime, these protections were established. But as we're having these conversations about the national security state, and I think from my perspective, it's maybe more helpful to think about the world we live in now in terms of that, as opposed to the war paradigm, because it seems like it's happening somewhere else, whereas the national security state is very much happening here. In a time where that state is very much on the up and up, and all the various policies that are attached to that, where do you see? So you have a public that is, it seems, increasingly in favor of torture. So there isn't a lot of popular pressure, at least, maybe not in favor of, but at least not so strongly opposed that you're going to have a democratically based movement to sort of implement these restrictions. You don't necessarily, therefore, have politicians who are accountable to that democratic polity wanting to institute these sorts of incremental restrictions. So where does the incentive come from? And who is going to do it?
All right, thank you. Where does the incentive come from? Who will do it? Yes, Jeremy.
Thank you very much indeed. Just on the comment part of your intervention, of course you're right on 2 points. The Convention Against Torture is relatively recent, and it is also the case that we have had various forms of torture in all sorts of contexts over the last few hundred years, particularly UK and France in the defense of their empires, and not to mention the abuses under the Soviets and under the Nazis. Couple of points, though. One is the Convention Against Torture is, in a sense, not new. It elaborates at greater length prohibitions that were already very firmly in place in the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights, and the European Convention, and just stepping slightly outside the realm of hard law in the Universal Declaration. So the human rights movement in its modern manifestation was always adamantly and absolutely opposed to torture and to inhuman and degrading treatment. So that was always there, often dishonored. There's a sense, too, that for a long, long time, the common law set its face against torture before other legal traditions did, partly by not incorporating torture into the law of proofs, not incorporating torture into civil procedure, incorporating it affirmatively into civil procedure, so that even as early as 1607, when a proposal was made to the courts that an assassin be put to the torture to try to reveal his accomplices, the English judges, as Blackstone said, to their credit, said no such proceeding was permissible under English law. So I think it is exactly, as you said, a mixed bag, but I would emphasize that human rights dimension. Now, on the question of where the impetus comes to restrict and try to build routines that will prevent torture in a democracy, many of whose members are not inclined to absolutely condemn it. I think, despite the general pessimism of my remarks, I'm more optimistic than you are about public opposition to torture, particularly when it's described as torture and particularly when it involves actually understanding what the techniques involved. The sort of baying support that one finds at a Trump rally is not necessarily duplicated in every element of civil society. But for the reasons that I indicated in my presentation a couple of hours ago, it is important that organized civil society groups get involved in this as well. So not just lawyers and academics, but churches and other organizations that can help the development and emergence of more thoughtful bodies of opinion. And people who may be willing to bay in support of torture at a loud rally may not necessarily map that onto opposition to things like video cameras and interrogation rooms, changes in training routines and so on. Some of these routines that I was putting such stock by don't have to necessarily parade themselves publicly as nothing but anti-torture, because they also have all sorts of other benefits. They rationalize the process of detention. The field manuals that are set up to govern legitimate interrogations are presented partly as highly professional as well as non-torturous. So a combination of, on the one hand, the modesty of these interventions, and on the other hand, the building up of organized constituencies within civil society, as opposed to just sort of undifferentiated support for this or opposition to that, might make a difference.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, two quick comments. I mean, Jeremy basically covered it, but I agree that I think the history you gave is a little bit, obviously it's a potted history and it didn't have very many nuances. I mean, there's a counter-torture history going back deep into the Enlightenment, obviously, and into Voltaire. And if you look at Fidelio, you see the sentiment very strongly. If you look at Don Juan, Byron, you see it as a cultural phenomenon very powerfully emerging in the 17th century as a kind of test of what is civilized government and also what is modern government. What is the idea of modern government? That torture is a kind of cruel throwback to something, I mean, you see that idea in Don Juan, among others. The second question, I was fairly bleak and probably too bleak in my talk. I mean, I think that, first of all, public opinion on this question is not easy to judge. It is true that there is a very large body now, over 40% of people who are very willing under all conditions to use torture. And that, I think, is an epiphenomenon of the war on terror. I think it's happened since the war on terror. But it isn't necessarily a majority. It has to do a lot with how you ask the question, obviously, as all polling does, and also the degree of fear that people are under at a given moment. It fluctuates in a kind of fever chart. I think also that Jeremy's points about regularity, about bureaucracies wanting things to be predictable, and particularly the officer corps, who are trained according to the Geneva Conventions, who think about reciprocity when it comes to their soldiers, is a very strong, and who also have vividly horrible memories of how this particular chapter turned out in their view. I think that is a very strong element militating against this, actually, against having this happen again. The other notion is the intelligence agencies, which, they say they wouldn't do it if ordered to do it. Trump says, if I order them to do it, they'll do it. Who knows what the answer of that will be? The one thing I think you can say is that I think the balance of the CIA, the large part of it, wants nothing to do with this. I think there's a very strong institutional element that never wants to go back to this kind of thing. Militating on the other side, finally, is the fact of a president, I mean, in the days after a successful attack that perhaps killed hundreds of people on American soil, under the pressure, if he's a Democrat from Republicans saying you have to do everything, you have to send these people to Guantanamo. And we have seen this after the Boston Marathon bombing, which killed 4 people, which was horrible, but killed a limited number of people, and we would certainly see it after a major attack that was unquestionably ordered from abroad, and so on. And I just wonder what the response will be. You might have the president and high executive officials essentially trying to get this stuff reinstituted in the face of opposition from the national security bureaucracy. I think that's quite possible.
We have time for one more comment, question. Is this gentleman, or this, yes. Yes, go ahead. Yes.
I was wondering what you all thought about how education reform might play into this. Maybe I'm naive, but I think that a more philosophical education in high school, middle school, might be able to change public opinion. As we said, I don't know if there's any ethical theory that endorses torture. Do you think that starting people learning philosophy at a younger age might be able to be somewhat of a solution to this, or am I just being naive?
I don't know. I would like to think it would work. My knowledge of the philosophers' position on this is actually quite pessimistic. Faced with the crisis of the 2000s, their main position was to begin constructing, entertaining, and playing with ticking bomb hypotheticals. And that will normally be the mode in which there would be, say, high school level discussion of this. And so it would be an act of great hope that into that mess, somebody would actually give articles by Henry Shue or somebody else into questioning the sanitized presentation of ticking bomb hypotheticals and confronting it with everything we know about the filthy reality of torture.
Well, I'm noticing my colleague here, Mark, has got a copy of Notes from the House of the Dead by Dostoevsky, and perhaps, Mark, you can... Well, but the question from the gentleman was about what you can teach, and you're teaching literature, and what would Dostoevsky have to say about us? How torture, what does it do to our soul?
Oh my goodness. I always find it perilous to cite Dostoevsky on questions like this because, of course, Notes from the House of the Dead was his memoir of his years in a Siberian prison camp, which took him from a right-thinking, Western-looking liberal, who, of course, would have denounced torture completely, to hard, dyed-in-the-wool Russian nationalist who believed in a strong autocratic state. So I'm not sure I can find any redemption in Dostoevsky. You know, he believed after he got out of prison that, as you pointed out in the quotation in the book, that the soul of the common people is to be found, in the soul of the common people is to be found all wisdom. So I guess we should worry about the polling results if that is truly the case. But I mean, it comes down to the fact, and Dror really gave an eloquent presentation of this idea. If you believe that wrongdoing, once exposed, will be corrected, if you believe that there is indeed a kind of inherent justice to our society and our fellow citizens, then you would see this general move towards transparency, indeed this discussion today and other discussions like it, as moving in a gradually positive direction.
Well, can I add one thing?
Absolutely, please do.
I think you mentioned something about middle school education, and I'd just say, as the oldest person in the room, having witnessed many generations of people come and go, my impression of middle school and high school education now is there's far more attention to values than there used to be. I think some of it, you know, you can criticize as being too partisan and whatnot, but I do feel that talking to my grandchildren and their peers, these people are much more sensitive to issues of public issues of ethics and proper behavior than people were in my day. I don't say they're better people, but I think there is some education going on, and I would certainly like to see us think up how we can implement what Jeremy said about trying to institutionalize reform in government and other institutions. And I want to just hog the thing for one more second.
Sure.
Before you end this program, to say that I'm going to go back to Berkeley to our law school with tales of the quality of the audience at NYU Law School, because you guys have been just terrific. And it's been wonderful to be able to be with you today.
Okay, unless there's one last burning question or comment from either our audience or our panels, I want to thank Jeremy. I want to thank all of our panelists and our audience for their excellent questions and comments. That concludes.